Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Danny Wysentowski. Before we get to today's topics, we have two pieces of exciting news. The first is that we resume a 5-day-a-week broadcast schedule starting Monday. The second is that we've selected a new host for this show. Her name is Elaine Shaw. Elaine brings more than a decade of experience in journalism and community engagement. She's been a producer for Southern California Public Radio and 9PBS here in St. Louis. She created critical content for the Ferguson Commission's report, Forward Through Ferguson, A Path Toward Racial Equity, and she later worked on that organization's education initiatives. More recently, she served as senior manager for external communications at Big Brothers Big Sisters of Eastern Missouri, and she is the co-editor of the forthcoming Humans of St. Louis book. We're tremendously excited about Elaine becoming host of this show. She starts on November 7th and will begin hosting the show later this fall. To read more about this announcement, visit stlpr.org/host. And now to today's show. In 1980, Missouri Attorney General John Ashcroft sued a defense contractor named Litton Systems, and that lawsuit made a particular point. See, at the time, the company employed thousands of people in Springfield, in southwest Missouri, where they made electrical components for the U.S. Navy. But there was another product, a byproduct, that the plant made, and that was huge amounts of hazardous waste, which it dumped into pits and sinkholes on the property. In that 1980 lawsuit, Ashcroft wrote, "We believe the discharges are contaminating the underground water system in the area." But that lawsuit didn't lead to a cleanup, and while it is among the earliest examples of official acknowledgement that something was wrong in the water in Springfield, it wasn't the last time. Far from it. Over the years, employees from Missouri's Department of Natural Resources repeatedly raised alarm about the site, especially after detecting the presence of a chemical called trichloroethylene at levels many times higher than considered safe for human contact. And yet, Springfield residents near the site kept drinking that water, pulling it out of wells, bathing in it, washing their hands, and those people were kept in the dark for some 40 years, until Missouri officials finally told residents about that contamination in 2018. This untold history of contamination and cover-up is the subject of a new investigation published this week by St. Louis Public Radio and the Midwest Newsroom. And here to talk about it are Eric Schmid, economic development reporter with St. Louis Public Radio, and Steve Vockrodt, investigative editor for the Midwest Newsroom. Eric, Steve, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
This story has so much in it, and it really feels like an excavation, not just of, one place in Missouri that's dealing with water issues, but the notion of how does the public become aware of a danger to them? And how does the government deal with those warnings? And why does it take so long for that information to get to the people that it really needs? Eric, I wanted to start with you. How did you get involved in this investigation? What drew you to this?
Well, it's kind of by chance in some regards. Back in September of 2021, there was a random email that came through that says, hey, we filed this lawsuit against this company, Northrop Grumman, which eventually bought Litton Systems, which we probably will get into. And the lawsuit alleged that there was this contamination with this chemical, trichloroethylene. And alarm bells went off in my head because I remembered when I was in school at Stony Brook University, which is on Long Island, the TCE and Northrop Grumman, they kept on coming up. It was a really big issue there. There was a facility that was tied to very similar types of contamination, and there was an investigation into that by the local newspaper there, and I saw that. And I immediately went, there's more to this story here. How can we do this? And I ended up messaging Steve that same day or that next day saying, I think there's something here to look into. Can we do something on this?
And Steve, this chemical, trichloroethylene or TCE, What can you tell us about what this chemical is and why it was being used at this plant in Springfield?
So TCE is basically a colorless liquid that it has the odor of chloroform, and it is a powerful solvent. And so for the purposes of this story, what TCE was used for was to clean grease and tape residue off of these circuit boards that this company manufactured primarily for the Navy and the other industries. And they would basically just dip these circuit boards in TCE. And TCE is toxic and harmful to the environment. It is linked with a number of diseases. And it is also heavier than water. And so if you dump it into the ground, it stays there for a long time and can slowly percolate ever downward. And that's what happened in Springfield, which is an area that is particularly susceptible to that, given the nature of the of the groundwork there. It's essentially almost kind of like a fractured topography there, where chemicals can sink quicker than they would in many other places.
This investigation, there was really kind of two sides that you were looking into. One part of it is just how dangerous TCE is and acknowledging, that this was being dumped. And you actually, not just found records of this, but talked to the employees who worked at this defense contractor. One of these employees was named Pat Brigance, and she worked for Litton from 1967 to 75. And she shared with you what it was like to be exposed to these fumes from this chemical TCE. And she said it was like getting high or being drunk just from being in the air. And then she passed out.
They would just say, get out, because it was so bad that you had to leave real fast. And I didn't have time. I was a new person, so I really didn't know what was going on. So I passed out from it. And but it's a liquid. You don't really know that it's in the air. I mean, it just, like he says, you just smell it. And then it just gets you high. You don't have no kind of ventilation, no nothing in there. So it was very bad. I know that.
Eric, hearing Pat describe, the effects of working around this chemical, that it was very known that it would have an effect on the human body just through the air, and that was, she was working in the 60s and 70s. How far back were you able to trace just the understanding that this is a chemical that does not interact with humans very well, and that it is dangerous?
I mean, I think as far back as they were working there, her husband, who was in the room when we were interviewing them both, said that there was a little pamphlet that they had gotten that said, TCE is a carcinogen according to the state of California, but that was about all that they got, and that was back in the 60s. So this was something that was kind of known by higher ups, you could say, as toxic, but for the regular workers, they knew what it was used for in the facility, and that's kind of all that they focused on. They used it to wash these circuit boards, remove the tape and the grease, and anything beyond that, it wasn't really top of mind or something that you would really latch onto and think about. At least that's what they expressed to us when they so graciously let us into their house to talk about this story with them.
Of course. And Steve, I wanted to ask you something about this time period as well. We opened the show talking about this lawsuit from the Missouri Attorney General in 1980. I mean, we're talking about more than 40 years ago, raising these concerns of, is the TCE, are these toxic chemicals spreading further than this plant site? Steve, what do we know about what Litton knew about at that time, and whether they were acting or trying to figure out, were they losing control of these chemicals?
Well, it's worth pointing out that when Litton opened in Springfield in the 60s, that predates the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the federal agency in charge of regulating industries that interact with the environment and generally supposed to protect the environment. And so some of the dumping and activities that were going on there were arguably not fully understood or fully regulated in the way that it is today. And at the time that Missouri first started raising some concerns about it, it was not particularly well known where the contamination had spread and how far it had gotten. There are indications that it was detected in the records that we had in pretty high quantities on the site, as you might expect. But there were some settlements that were entered into, and for a long period of time following that in the 80s, there just wasn't much discussion, public discussion, about contamination issues coming from Lytton, which continued to operate in Springfield up until 2007. And so that's a long period of time that Lytton was doing business in different ways in Springfield.
We were talking to Steve Vockrodt, investigative editor for the Midwest Newsroom, and Eric Schmid, economic development reporter with St. Louis Public Radio, about their new investigation into how Missouri officials failed to alert residents of Springfield that toxic chemicals had leaked into their groundwater. I wanted to ask, and bring in this notion of what dumping these chemicals really meant, because, Steve, you were just talking about that when this plant was in operation, it was before the EPA was made. There was, limited understanding of what these chemicals could do, but it sounded like the workers that you talked to really understood that this sort of approach of just dumping these chemicals into the ground, it had an impact, and it had an impact on their own behavior. And in your reporting, you interviewed another worker who had worked at the Lytton plant named Danny Eddington, and he described disposing of these chemicals like TCE from the tanks, and he described how he did it.
And it's kind of had a screw-on deal on the bag. I just take my belt off, wrap around that screw, and then pull it so it unscrew and fall off, and it just dump.
This was into some of the pits that were already dug back there?
Yeah. Yeah, there was quite a bit of it dumped out there.
Eric, we just listened to a bit of Danny Eddington, who was describing, dumping these chemicals, and you interviewed him in a hospice, and just days later he passed away, and he suggested that his employer, Lytton at the time, didn't try to care for the workers because it would appear that the company was taking responsibility, and this liability would be something that company, of course, fought over for quite a long time. But what do we know about the health effects on these workers? You spoke to some other folks who suggested that they had known many friends, many former coworkers who passed away from cancer. What did you find out about the health effects, in this group of people?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you hear in Danny is someone who is quite frail, and it comes across, and even being in that room with him was incredibly humbling, and I think Steve would probably agree with that. The topic of people, former Lytton workers, old-timers, as Pat Vergant's, Danny Eddington's sister-in-law, would say, the number of them who had died from various medical ailments, it was so many that was a key topic of conversation. It was something that came up multiple times in our interview with Danny. He talked about, I have this list of people that I can get you. It's on my phone. He tried to locate it while we were talking to him, and he, unfortunately couldn't. The unfortunate thing is there's not enough epidemiological studies about the specifics of how TCE relates to the human body, especially in the case of Lytton, to say that the lung cancer or the cancers, of kidney or liver or whatever other ailments that former Lytton workers had is 100% tied to the TCE that they used and worked with at the company. But that doesn't stop the former workers from highlighting and saying that that they do believe that it's something that is a contributing factor to the medical ailments they had.
You can really hear it in his voice, the frailty that he had, and the other workers who were aware of others becoming sick. Now, part of what was really frustrating and eye-opening about your investigation is that there were a number of both lawsuits but also correspondence in the DNR, the Department of Natural Resources in Missouri, of employees talking about, where are these chemicals going? It seems very likely that they're leaching out into the groundwater beyond just where this plant is. And this happens in the 80s, and this then happens again in the 90s, and it seems to also happen again in the early 2000s after Northrop Grumman purchased this site. And Steve, I wanted to ask, about some of these records, because this story just includes these remarkable passages of these emails and correspondence. Steve, what was it like trying to get these records of, what the DNR was talking about in the mid to late 90s?
Well, I didn't know what we would get. Eric opened our conversation talking about how he had contacted me about my interest in this story, and I could hear it when he was describing what he thought was worth looking into. It was compelling, and I was grateful that he asked that I help. And one of the things that I frequently do in my reporting is I send out a lot of records requests just to see what government records say, what they hold, what they show. In this case, we sent a records request into the Department of Natural Resources in November of last year. So we're basically 11 months ago, almost to the day. And they were slow to get that to us. And finally, they told us at one point, they said, look, there are 20 linear feet of these records that you're requesting.
Wow.
Yeah. And the implication was that and they existed in paper form. They hadn't all been digitized, and they suggested that there would be a cost associated with digitizing and sending them to us. And I finally said, well, how about we just come there and look at them? And they agreed. So me and Eric this last summer traveled to Jefferson City, where the Department of Natural Resources has a couple of office buildings, and we essentially sat in in a windowless room for 2 days, and they weren't lying about the 20 feet.
Wow.
They were. I mean, I didn't measure them, but they met the eyeball test, and we just read through reams and reams of paper, and we found some of these records, within all of that, of these employees talking about, look, based on the data that we're seeing of TCE levels and other contaminants on Litton's property, it has to be going off of the property. And one of the key things about all of this is in 1993, Litton and the Department of Natural Resources reached an agreement to clean up the property. But the cleanup was limited to Litton's property. And it was in the aftermath of that some of these employees were raising concerns of, hey, look, based on everything we're seeing, like this has got to be going off-site. When is Litton going to investigate off-site? And that didn't start happening until 2002.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that came up in the documents multiple times from different people, too. It wasn't just like one crusading DNR employee. It was people who were, who may not have even known each other, raising very similar concerns.
Wow. And it really wasn't until, as you describe in this investigation, until 2018 when an unrelated, environmental spills, there was a tourist attraction near there that detected TCE nearby, raised an alarm, and it really kind of forced the DNR to acknowledge, what it had already known. And I wanted to, bring out this incredible, you talked to one of these residents named Don York, who had moved into the area in 2007, again, years after it was already known. And he described kind of what it was like trying to talk to the DNR about what this actually meant for land that he lived on.
I pinned down their geologist at their public meeting. How long is this going to take? The state's geologist said it could be over 100 years. Now, over 100 years? I was in my 60s, now I'm in my 70s. How am I supposed to relate to that? As you're fixing the problem. You're overseeing fixing the problem. My daughter won't be alive in 100 years unless she's a miracle. My grandkids are going to struggle to be alive in 100 years.
That was Springfield resident Don York talking to reporters Eric Schmid and Steve Vockrodt about this investigation into the chemical that had been leaking out into Springfield. Eric, very quickly, for people like Don who are wondering about, our land is contaminated for 100 years, Where does this leave them? What can they do now?
I mean, I think that they have gotten to the point where they've filed a lawsuit against the company Northrop Grumman, basically saying, you withheld this information about contamination from us, and we would like damages paid out for that. And that's kind of the last place that they can go is to seek legal action. I think for other residents, it's a little bit different because the levels of contamination in their private wells isn't necessarily like as high as what the Yorks had. The Yorks had something that was on the order of 17 times higher than what the EPA considers safe. But of course, that's just what the EPA considers safe. There's not really a standard that says, over 5 parts per billion is unsafe, but if you have 4.9 parts per billion, that's somehow safe. That's kind of something that we ran up against in this article. I think moving forward, it's, you put filters on your water, you put filters on the well, but for a lot of the dual part of this story was it's not just moving forward with your water, but it's moving forward with how can you regain trust in an entity that was ostensibly supposed to protect you.
That really is a matter of trust. And if you want to read the full story on this, the full investigation, and including DNR's response and apology for the way that it handled this, you can read the entire investigation on stlpr.org, titled Missouri Knew of Contamination in Springfield's Groundwater Decades Before Anyone Told Residents, written by Eric Schmid, economic development reporter with St. Louis Public Radio, and Steve Vockrodt, the investigative editor for the Midwest Newsroom. Eric, Steve, thank you so much for being here today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having us.
This episode was produced by Danny Wysentowski.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr. Our production intern is Avery Rogers. Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Our podcast proudly supports St. Louis artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.